So, I have some books here. So for my presentation today, I will be looking mostly at Graves' historical fiction. Specifically, I will be discussing the Doubleday and Company 1949 published version of the Islands of Unwisdom. There is a 1950 UK release of the work called the Isles of Unwisdom, and a digital version which became available in 2019. These versions should be comparable, but any quotes or notes in this presentation are attributed and valid for the Doubleday published version. All right. The Islands of Unwisdom is Graves' hybrid fiction-nonfiction retelling of the 1595 voyage of four Spanish ships, San Geronimo, San Isabel, Santa Catalina, and San Felipe, which carried 378 men, women, and children from Peru to the Solomon Islands to establish a permanent colony for Spain, under the command of Don Alvaro de Mendaña, and Nira, who Graves calls Don Alvaro de Mendaña y Castro. I'll use Inera because that is his historically recorded name. The expedition discovered the Marquesas and the Santa Cruz Islands. Inera died during the voyage, and the fleet traveled to Manila with his wife, Doña Isabella Barreto, as commander. In the end, the remains of the fleet returned to Peru, and the mission was considered a failure. Graves' retelling is based on historical documents which were translated. However, whether we call this creative nonfiction or historical fiction, the story was expanded and dramatized by Graves to create a readable, cohesive, and exciting narrative. Overall, I believe Graves accomplished this. However, considering the conference's presidential theme of visibility, I will discuss how sight functions both in and outside of the narrative. I will argue that the Islands of Unwisdom is not visible enough and does not receive the scholarly attention that it should. Graves' historical fiction, particularly this novel, deserves re-examination by contemporary academics. This paper hopefully is a step toward making these works better known. I will come at this issue of visibility from two directions. I will show how the novel is misrepresented online to its detriment, and I will show the utility of several contemporary theories and studies and fields which will show how looking, seeing, and gazing operate within the text. I will begin by looking at the Kierkegaard's review of the Islands of Unwisdom, which was published November 1st, 1949. I'm going to give you a few snippets of what they said with my commentary after. Kierkegaard's review. This novel is a cleverly balanced mixture of spice, fact, humor, and adventure on and off the high seas in the year 1595. Another reviewer called it a swashbuckling tale. My commentary, I found little swashing, buckling, spice, or adventure. There was definitely no fun. Kierkegaard's review. These Christian souls flee from island to island, plundering, murdering, raping, and indulging in sundry unchristian acts. Commentary. Between the island flitting, they starved and died by droves from illness. Kierkegaard's review, the women of the expedition, like the general's wife, Isabel, are bawdy, beautiful, and a bit depraved, as they in turn find the native women in the islands. Commentary, please note, it's unclear if the Spanish women find the native women bawdy, beautiful, or depraved, or if it refers to the Spanish men finding them that way. Kierkegaard's review, the men are hard, restless, lusty. The leader is a braggart and a sadist and achieves the dimensions of a character of evil. Commentary, Don Alvaro took a vow of celibacy for the voyage, or in reality, he was possibly impotent, which Isabel claims at one point in the novel. Here is a typical reference to Don Alvaro as he tries to placate his wife. Remember, he's a character of evil. Quote, "Why, of course, my love," Don Alvaro answered unhappily. "The sergeant is free as an uncaged bird." Yet he was still anxious to pacify the colonel. As soon as Doña Isabel retired, he sent for Don Lorenzo and the admiral and begged them to go ashore and use whatever arguments they pleased to induce the prodigal to return, unquote. That's the character of evil right there. I've added this section to illustrate how the Kirkus Review misrepresents the Island of Unwisdom. Instead of a serious work of historical fiction, one might expect a boy's adventure tale designed to titillate. This is not the only review or summary online that failed to adequately represent the novel. Interestingly, each sales site that I visited used the same blurb about the novel, all of them. The other interesting fact about that is that Wikipedia uses the exact same blurb with no changes as their entry for the novel. So whether we like it or not, people use Wikipedia, and that's what they're reading. Okay. Part of the Islands of Invisibility is that peer-reviewed scholarship is sparse. Searches for Robert Graves and the Islands or Isles of Unwisdom, bless you, return links to purchase the digital version, right? So you can go and buy it. One will find a few book reviews, a few dissertations, a few monographs, sites selling digital copies or used copies, and links to Graves' poetry most often. Most researchers are interested in Graves the poet, not Graves the historical prosaist, as we know. I, Claudius, its sequel Claudius the God, and Goodbye to All That are the most common prose hits online. However, a few useful and informative monographs are out there. This one is Catherine Snipes, Robert Graves, 1970. It has some good stuff. I say, Snipes' historical novels on murder, Milton, and the Spanish Main chapter contains a small section, pages 152 to 157, devoted to a synopsis and analysis of the Islands of Unwisdom. Snipe notes that the novel, quote, is a somewhat depressing account, unquote, of contact with indigenous people that eventually and predictably goes south because of, quote, the combined stupidity and violence, unquote, of the military and Doña Isabel's three brothers who, quote, ensure disaster wherever they go, unquote. Doña Isabel is, quote, beautiful, proud, and cruel as her arrogant brothers, unquote. Don Alvaro is devout but indecisive and unable to control the stubborn wills that surround him, unquote. Please note how this differs from the Kirkus review of the book. Unlike most other summaries that I found online, Snipes seems to have actually read the novel. As Snipes suggests in polite language, the voyage to the South Pacific is a disaster and the voyagers are a mess. A few other sources are available. Interestingly, most books about Robert Graves are just called Robert Graves. This is Robert H. Cannery's Robert Graves, 1980. For example, examines Graves' life and career mostly in relation to his poetics. Cannery's description is accurate. Also, to be fair, all of the information that he does use for the Islands of Unwisdom comes from this paragraph right here, which is Robert Graves' introduction. Like, that's where all of the information is.
On the first page.
Both Cannery's blurb and Graves' introduction note that Doña Isabel's command of the fleet sparked his initial interest. But Graves goes on to note that the most interesting part of this tale is that it illuminates early European colonialism carried out before the Pilgrims set off for the North American continent. That is a fascinating statement. After reading the novel, I agree that it offers insight into early colonialism. However, despite being interesting and having a certain historicity, which I read as historical authenticity, and historical importance, I could not locate any mention of the novel in colonialism, post-colonialism articles. Granted, my search wasn't exhaustive. It was a couple of afternoons. But I would expect that someone interested in early Spanish colonialism might have found it interesting enough to include it in their references or bibliography. Clearly, the novel has a visibility problem. Now, I will suggest a few avenues for consideration by contemporary scholars. Unfortunately for this presentation, because I packed this down from like 15 pages into 8, I will only deeply examine one, which is the feminist surveillance theories. However, this novel is filled with cultural intersections that would be an interesting read and study for transnational scholars. Transnational scholars look at texts that move across borders or boundaries, the places where cultures collide. This novel is rife with movement. Graves is a displaced Briton writing in and on foreign locales. The Islands of Unwisdom examines the intersection of a global North nation with several global South cultures. The story moves from Peru to the South Pacific, ending eventually in the Philippines. As an example of a transnational moment on one of these first encounters with indigenous islanders, the Spaniards are offered some meat, which they immediately assume the joint was the quarter of a boy with a delicate arm and a small hand. This is clearly an example of the Spanish bringing culturally accepted ideas and bias about natives traveling to new areas. They brought the idea of cannibals with them and applied it to indigenous islanders they had just met. Another character notes that since these islanders did not eat their own families, they exhibited a certain gentleness of character that can be turned into an advantage when Christianizing them. Okay, there's problems. No one suggested it might be part of some other primate or even considers for a moment that it is not human. This type of dialogue is filled in the book. Global beliefs, global North reality and beliefs is common once the ship reaches the Pacific Islands. The other area of study, eco-criticism, could make interesting use of this text as the entire tale is joined intimately with the surrounding environment. Food ecology becomes increasingly important as the demand for food and water outstrips the subsistence level existence of the indigenous islanders. In fact, food ecology drives the friction between the various cultures, including the Spanish from one ship and the Spanish on other ships. Ecofeminism would find interesting points in the novel. For example, quote, "The common opinion of our soldiers were that these islands must be very fertile to breed such robust men and such graceful women, but were too small for our purpose," unquote. The comment, "too small for our purposes," is an observation about the islands, not the natives. However, the distance between islands and the dependent cloud is fairly large, leading to one to wonder if it was intentionally ambiguous, since the Spanish men make full use of the indigenous women. To further example how contemporary scholarship can benefit from looking at the Islands of Unwisdom, I will examine with more depth Graves' depiction of Doña Isabel Barreto through the lens of feminist surveillance theory. Throughout the tale, Doña Isabel is under almost constant scrutiny, judgment, and commentary. While the novel is practically invisible, Doña Isabel is hypervisible. Observations are made about Isabel carry a large portion of the narrative. At points, she becomes a monstrous female character. She is depicted as promiscuous, as a harpy, a shrew, a man-eater, a sorceress, and along with other unflattering descriptions. While the novel eliminates Doña Isabel through the gazes of the males around her, she fights to make space for herself and manages to avoid complete objectification and dismissal. Doña Isabel's command of the fleet is what drew Graves to the story originally. Despite her importance and individuality in the character list for the novel, her name follows Don Alvaro de Mendaña y Niera as Doña Isabel Barreto, his wife. Later, she is described as the glory of womanhood of His Most Christian Majesty's possessions overseas. However, Doña Isabel deserves watching as she will not easily be reduced to an appendage or a possession. Though surveillance studies are associated with visual and digital media mostly, these tools offer insight at any point where vision, power, and technology intersect. Surveillance exists to gather information to influence, manage, or direct the actions of others. In other words, to control them and to disempower them. Surveillance is never innocent as it recasts the body as a social actor, sorting some bodies as normal, legal, or acceptable, and others as illegal and marginal. Historically, the body most often labeled as not normal and therefore unacceptable is the female body. Barbara Creed notes that, quote, "Freud linked the sight of the Medusa to the equally horrifying sight of the mother's genitals, the monstrous feminine, as constructed within and by a patriarchal and phallocentric ideology, is related intimately to the problem of sexual difference and castration." Unquote. Within the Islands of Unwisdom, the depictions of female characters, especially Doña Isabel, sometimes highlights or creates the monstrous as she is depicted repeatedly as emasculating Don Alvaro. As noticed, surveillance requires a technology and often some type of mediator. Graves uses the technology of writing to record the action, thoughts, and beliefs of Don Isabel and the opinions, thoughts, and beliefs that others have about Don Isabel. Or does he? As noted, observations of Doña Isabel carry most of the novel's narrative. However, there is only one narrative voice in the novel, and it belongs to Don Andres Serrano, the Voyage Chronicle, called Little Andres by pretty much everyone in the novel. Little Andres is not a reliable narrator. In fact, he seems very biased and prone to lying. He notes at one point, quote, "I can vouch for this much, that she and Doña Mariana sat together on the poop with their eyes fixed on the Santa Isabel, whispering and giggling behind their hands like naughty little girls," unquote. This occurs as the Santa Isabel sinks because, word has it, Isabel has drilled holes in the hull because the ship wasn't nice enough to carry her sister. At one point, a soldier asked Andres if he would like to join their betting pool. His answer is he doesn't know how to write his name. So that's Andres, the illiterate ship's chronicler. Doubtful. In text, when Andres is not physically present to observe Isabel's bad behavior, he clearly notes who saw and said bad things about Doña Isabel. It's seldom flattering. Here's an example about Don Alvaro, quote, "Though the general may play his part as leader of this expedition with dignity and courage, he walks already like one who treads his destined road to the grave of the gallows. What drives him is not his will, but the will of Doña Isabel." The connection between vision, power, and problematic sexuality begins in the first chapter when little Andres relates a risque story called The Blind Girl of Panama. In the tale, a poor orphan blind girl spends her time piously weaving, but in reality, she's only interested in men and their weapons. When she gropes Don Juan's, interesting name, Don Juan's other weapon, he exclaims, quote, "Though I am heartily sorry to disappoint you, I have nothing else, but some women will never be put off, try how you may," unquote. So this story characterizes women as sexually promiscuous and predatory, and men are the unwilling victims of their desires. This characterization continues throughout the novel and repeats and grows. Eventually, it is applied to almost every woman on the voyage. All single women are highly encouraged, read as forced, to marry to stop them from vying their trade and causing friction between the sailors and the soldiers. However, Isabel receives most of Andres' attention as he makes her hypervisible and hyper-responsible for all bad occurrences. Andres notes, "I had seen enough of the world to know that Doña Isabel was not yet old enough to turn devout, being then scarcely 27 and at the height of her beauty, and suspecting that her kindness towards him was an offshoot of her enmity towards the colonel," unquote. Okay, so I will stop with this quote, the next quote, because it perfectly illustrates the issue of Isabel's visibility. Though Andres' constant observation of Isabel with commentary explaining what it means in the larger world, the reader has become complicit. We start believing that she is a horrible person. We see Isabel as the cause. We agree with the story that we have been told. Why not, right? Quote, "Isabel is arranging for certain people to be gone. Doña Isabel, seeing that her position had sensibly been weakened, resolved that it must be now or never," unquote. Little Andres gives us the action and the rationalization of something and points the finger directly at Isabel while speaking for her. Interestingly, Andres almost never speaks with Isabel in the entire novel, but he is privy to her inner emotions. That is surveillance at its best or worst, depending on whether you are Isabel or Andres. Thank you.